Good morning. Good morning. That's a little better, thank you. Distinguished guests, Dean Roble, colleagues, students, I am Agnes He, the Director for Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. It is my great honor to welcome you here to this symposium, which marks the culmination of our year-long celebration of the Center's 10th anniversary. But let me first acknowledge the many sorts of help that we have received in the last year that has made this symposium possible. First of all, we are very grateful to a Run Shaw lecture grant, as well as a FAST grant. FAST grant is specifically for Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. We're very grateful for the administrative support from the Dean's Office, and particularly Lauren Donovan. Lauren, where are you? Lauren Donovan, Evelyn Cruz, and Rachel Rodriguez. I don't think Rachel is here today. And last but not least, our magnificent MIC staff, led by my dear colleague, Professor Chikako Nakamura, who's always at the back. And the interns, Isabella, right there. Wen, at the back, and Cameron. Cameron probably just left the room momentarily. So thank you everyone for putting a lot of hard work to make this possible. Now, our research center has been driven by a very clear vision, which is to conduct research that strengthens our understanding of the connection between language, culture, and society. So research has always been at the core of what we do. It informs our work, it shapes our instruction, and it also fosters the kinds of conversation that we would like to see happen, both on campus and in the world. So in the past decade, we have thrived as a hub for doing collaborative research because the kinds of issues that we tackle, multilingualism, language and cultural identity, language policy, and communication in a globalized world require perspectives from many different departments. So by bringing together students and scholars from different disciplines and departments, we have been able to address these issues in ways that are innovative and I hope impactful. So I want to emphasize that it is this collaborative nature of the work that we do that has driven much of the success that we've had in the last decade. So today we are particularly fortunate and privileged to have 4 world-class scholars who themselves and collectively exemplify this kind of a commitment to collaborative and creative research in the work that they do. And I'm very much looking forward to the insights that they will be sharing with us today and tomorrow. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for your contribution and support as we advance the mission of the center. I'm very hopeful that this symposium will generate lots of conversations and collaborations which would then help us delineate and define the work that we will do in the next decade. Now, none of the achievements that we've had in the past 10 years, whether it is research or outreach, would have been possible without the support of the College of Arts and Sciences, where myself and my many MIC-affiliated colleagues are based. So it is with gratitude that I would now like to invite the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. David Roble, to please come to the podium, and the Dean will offer the official welcome. Dean Roble, please.
Well, good morning, everybody. I can't take much credit for what's happened in terms of College of Arts and Sciences support over the last 10 years. having been here for just about 10 weeks. But certainly I'd like to take partial credit for what's happened in that brief time. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to offer a few words to welcome you all and to let you know how important the work of this Center for Multicultural and Intercultural Communication is, how important it is for our university community and for building community here at Stony Brook and facilitating human understanding and community well beyond the halls and the walls of higher education. Over the past decade, the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication has been at the forefront of groundbreaking research, expanding our understanding of multilingualism, language acquisition, and the social dynamics of intercultural communication. Its impact has been felt in the academic world and in communities beyond our campus. The Center's work exemplifies the spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration that the College of Arts and Sciences values. By bringing together scholars from multiple departments and disciplines, the Center has shown how cross-departmental partnerships lead to innovative solutions to complex global challenges. And the Center exemplifies the shared vision of the College of Arts and Sciences' many and varied departments, centers, and institutes. We create new knowledge and understanding of the physical world and the human condition through our research and creative activity. And then we put that new knowledge and understanding to work to improve our communities and to strengthen our social structures. Through its focus on language and social justice, the Center has enriched our campus and ensured that the diverse voices of our community are heard. Its outreach efforts have empowered students and faculty to engage meaningfully with issues of equity and inclusion, both locally and globally. So as we celebrate these milestones, we also look forward to the Center's continued success. We're excited to see the new directions in which its research and outreach will evolve over the next 10 years as it continues to shape the conversations around language and culture. So on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I want to reaffirm the college's commitment to supporting the Center's mission. We believe in the transformative power of multilingualism and intercultural communication, and we will continue to invest in this vital work for years to come. And I'd also like to offer a very special thanks to Agnes, the director of the MIC, for her dedication to multidisciplinary collaboration, and to all of the Institute's affiliated faculty, staff, and students for continued successes in achieving well over $1 million in federal and internal grants for research studies since the Center's inception. Congratulations to all of you on your achievements and contributions to this important center within the college. And at this time, I'm pleased to recognize today's lecture as the first in our fall 2024 Sir Run Shaw Lecture Series. Back in 1985, the year I came to America, it turns out, no connection at all between these two things, the Shaw Foundation of Hong Kong Limited made a gift of $1 million to the College of Arts and Sciences through the stewardship of C.N. Yang, Einstein Professor of Physics, and then President Marburger. This gift was used to establish the Sir Run Shaw Endowment, one of the earliest endowments established by the Stony Brook Foundation. The endowment proceeds support our Sir Run Shaw Lecture Series, which allows us to bring important guests such as today's distinguished speaker, Alison Phipps, to participate in our Stony Brook College of Arts and Sciences intellectual and cultural community. So thanks everybody for being here. Looking forward to a wonderful symposium, and let's get started.
Thank you, Dean Roble. I think we all heard the Dean said that he's committed to continuing supporting the MIC, right? For at least next decade. We all heard that. I would now like to invite the Dean, our distinguished speakers, and all MIC-affiliated faculty members to please come to the podium, and we will take a group photo, please. I would like to invite my distinguished colleague, Professor Loredana Polezzi to introduce our speaker. But first, a word about Loredana. Loredana has been a core member of the MIC, and she is our D'Amato Endowed Chair Professor in Italian Studies and Italian American Studies, and multidisciplinary scholar who's committed to multilingualism and intercultural communication, research and outreach. So, Loredana, please.
Thank you, Agnes. That was far too kind. And I must say, first of all, that I arrived here, I was saying just a second ago, I arrived here in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and MIC and the colleagues have been such a wonderful intellectual, but also really affective home for me. So it's wonderful to be here to celebrate the 10 years. So it is also a pleasure, and absolutely not a rhetorical one, to welcome Professor Alison Phipps to the stage today as our opening speaker and Saran Rancho guest speaker for this symposium celebrating 10 years of the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication. Alison Phipps is UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow and Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at that same institution. And Alison and I go back a long way. We met in the 1990s as young rookies. Literally. And we have repeatedly crossed paths over the years. We've shared jokes and concerns, plotted together, planned small revolutions. I always think of her when faced with university bureaucracy. I'm looking at the dean here. Because, and how at one point we were both trying to get our respective British institutions to recognize the importance of languages, plural, by making them a formal item in research ethics applications. Her motto, in the face of obstinacy, forms the final frontier. For a number of years, we worked at parallel sister projects under the Translating Cultures initiatives of the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we also engaged with the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund, and you'll hear about the political debacle that ended in during her talk. Most of all, though, I admired, from wherever I was, her strength, her productivity, her creativity, her generosity, and her ability to innovate and to stay true to herself, to her strong sense of what our academic mission is and must continue to be. Her CV speaks for itself. Besides the Glasgow UNESCO Chair, she was the Carl Distinguished Visiting Professor at Otago University, Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2019-2020, Thinker in Residence at the EU Hawke Centre, University of South Australia in 2016, Visiting Professor at Auckland University of Technology and Principal Investigator for the AHRC Large Grant Researching Multilingually at the Borders of Languages, the Body, Law and the State. She was also PI for the Cultures of Sustainable and Inclusive Peace Network Plus, and was co-director of the Global Challenges Research Fund South-South Migration Hub from 2019 to 2024. She is an ambassador of the Scottish Refugee Council. She received an OBE in the UK in 2012, and honorary doctorates from the University of Edinburgh and the University of Waterloo in Canada in 2023. She's an academic, an activist, an educator, and a published poet, and a member of the Iona community. She also says, that I should say, that she is a grandmother, some grandmother. She is a doer, she is a thinker, she is a changer, and she's here today to help us celebrate what we have done and remember what we are here to do, how much there is still to do, and how much we can and must do. Her title is Enabling Environments, Fugitive Spaces, and Restorative Practices for Intercultural Dialogue and Linguistic Justice. Alison, over to you.
Thank you so much, Loredana, for those immensely kind words and that reminder of how long we've known each other and the journeys that we've been on. But I want to start by, first of all, thanking Saran Rancho for an example of philanthropy and of generosity and of a genuine belief in the power of the arts and culture and languages with this endowment, and how immensely privileged I feel to be here at this time, at this moment in history, when the world is seeking desperately for artistry, for subtlety, for gentleness, for ways of using that kung fu energy for which he is famed, where you might take what is coming at you that is bad and turn it to something strong and good and powerful. So I want to pay tribute to that vision and that donation before I begin. I also want to thank Lauren and Eleanor for organising me twice. I want to thank, obviously, Agnes and Joy and Loredana for those conversations that we began to think about the scope of what I might speak to you about today. And obviously to my distinguished colleagues who are speaking at this symposium with us, to Gaofang, to Michael, and to Antonella, my colleague from the other side of the country in Scotland. There's a real rivalry between Edinburgh and Glasgow, if you don't know it. So, and I'm particularly looking forward to hearing what they say, because they're real linguists. You know, they really know their stuff about languages, and much of what I will be speaking about will be more on the side of the work around intercultural communication, on culture and social justice. And what I've been noticing are some of the themes coming through in the most recent work, particularly undertaken by postgraduate students, but also in undergraduate dissertations that I'm often invited to read or even to examine, and which are really on the button. So some of the literature that I'll be citing, and there are many references that you'll see on the wallpaper behind me, and many pretty images. Some of them are of nature because it restores me, and maybe it'll do the same to you as I speak of difficult things. And many of them are of the artists around the world and linguists around the world that I've worked with on the projects that Loredana has spoken about. And they have asked me specifically to appear in photographs when I travel the world. So when you see these extraordinary, beautiful images of artistic bodies doing their thing, then please think and applaud the Noyam Institute for African Dance, Literature Festival in Harare, the Chipau Dance Company, and also theatre festivals and language and arts and writing festivals that have been undertaken across the occupied Palestinian territories over the last 15 years of my work. I also want to thank, because I said I would, the driver yesterday who picked me up, and we spent 3 hours in a car together having one of the most interesting political discussions I've had in really quite a long time. A generous man, a man who is a migrant to this country, a man who is bilingual, and a man who's trying to find his way in the morass of sloganisms that bombard him, and who had a lot of questions for me and a lot of questions for himself, and who ended our journey saying he felt it was time that he planted a garden. So thank you all. This lecture comes with a heart warning. We live in an age where we are horrified daily. And our task is to be horrified daily, to not become immune, to have empathy, to find words when we are silenced, and to find silence to mourn, to weep, to hold fast to reason, to hold fast to hand fast reason through the flames. Achille Mbembe has said that we live in an age of necropolitics. And for those of you who've not encountered that term before, I'm aware we have lots of lovely students here from different people's courses. Necropolitics means a politics predicated on death and killing, people who we decide are less worthy of life, or as Judith Butler says, less grievable. And Achille Mbembe, in his book, The Post-Colony, in 1992, writes about necropolitics as dominating many of the structures and countries of the world that have decided that against the statutes and the declarations and the many agreements of the United Nations and its agencies, that some people will just die, and that is how it should be. And when we encounter on our daily news feeds, through the din of propaganda, and through WhatsApp messages or internet messenger, these stories of people bound up in the entanglements of global violence, we find that words fail us, and we find ourselves in a place of silence. And we find ourselves, as I have found myself, particularly over the last year, asking ourselves, how does it come that we fail to speak or name or understand what we are seeing? But we also find ourselves, those of us, and MIC is a really strong example of that, those of us with a professional and a scholarly commitment to culture and social justice, we find ourselves needing to work with words, because words are what we have as linguists. We have many, many words. In fact, as linguists and scholars of multilingualism, we have probably more words than we deserve. We have many words to work with, and yet still we find ourselves falling into this abyssal silence, this place where speech is difficult, and it's difficult to know what to say. So that's necropolitics, the place where words will fail. But also we find ourselves in a place of what I'm terming necroethics. Necroethics. And that's where we hear ethical justifications for the killing of other human beings who are not like ourselves. A necroethics which commits us ethically to an investment in the politics of death, of necropolitics. And we see this made in many different and very complicated ways around the globe. The image that I'm sharing with you here is one of Calais in northern France, the Pas de Calais, where people who have sought asylum and who have travelled to try and cross the sea to the United Kingdom, people who I work with on a daily basis, are given containers to live in, 14 people at a time. Usually men and young boys in these containers. They prefer to live in those little tents that they've made themselves. They see those, when you speak to them, as reminding them a bit of home, as something they've made that they're proud of, as an element of labour. But they're required by the security state and the emergency laws in France to live in these containers. Many of them, particularly those who have come from Eritrea, have already spent a lot of time in containers, which are used when we in the global north have discarded them as the prisons and the torture camps for people who refuse to act as part of generalized conscription for 40 years of your life in the state that is Eritrea. So you can imagine the encounter with a necroethics that says it is safer for you to be in a container when you are somebody who's already experienced that as a place of torture or a place of trafficking. Back in 1942, just after she'd arrived in New York, Hannah Arendt, that great refugee thinker and scholar of language, who really helped us tease out what had been happening during the imprescriptible abomination that was the Holocaust against the Roma and the Sinti, against people who were homosexual, against intellectuals, and against the Jewish people. She helped us understand some of what was happening. And one of the things she said was that at that time, nobody wants to know that contemporary history, so this is back in the 1940s, has created a new kind of human being, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and internment camps by their friends. And whenever I'm in the Pas-de-Calais speaking, be it in a bit of Arabic or in French with those who are held in places like this, or when I'm in detention centres within the United Kingdom, those words really haunt me because I hear the denial that is part of it. Nobody wants to know. Part of that silencing that goes when words fail us. So for us as linguists and scholars of words, these events that are revisiting us and that have arguably always been with us, we might think back to the British colonial genocidal actions with the Mau Mau back in the 1950s in Kenya. There are many instances where in different parts of the world that violence that we feel so close to us now has been present. One of the things that's also challenging to us in our scholarship, I believe, is what I'm calling here, after my colleague Anna Storch, who is the Professor of African Linguistics at Cologne University, is the hegemonic view of language or languages. And she describes it well in this quote here, basically as a view that sees language as a single entity that can be counted. So we see it all the time in diversity statements, don't we? I see it in my city. In Glasgow, in our schools, 66 languages are spoken. And that's almost like a label or a fetish or a proxy for diversity. Look how diverse we are. And also, look how many problems we have. Because it's often a precursor to saying that this vast exuberance, abundance of linguistic repertoires is somehow a problem. So I think this hegemonic view of language is one that we as scholars, those of you as undergraduates, but also those of you as teachers and researchers are presently unraveling and unpicking in your work and doing it in different ways in different places. What it looks like in linguistics or sociolinguistics or applied linguistics or multilingual studies is different to what it might look like in my position, which is kind of as a very good friend to applied linguistics, where I'm looking at the tree in your garden that's overhanging my garden and going, hey, come round and look at the view from my side. You might just want to chop a couple of branches off. I think we'll get a bit more fruit if you do that way. So this view of languages as entities that you can count has really been with us through the Enlightenment. It's part of that positivist understanding of language. Languages can be counted. The insides of languages can also be counted. The way in which we lay things out in our research with lines and numbers are all part of this numericalization of what it is we are doing. And Anna says that language is words and phrases, not gestures, song and movement in that understanding. Languages are, in other words, named, counted, exhibited as a commodity that's controlled by individual players in individual disciplines. And when they're used in contexts where very particular language ideologies prevail, and by language ideology I mean almost the politicized ways in which we understand what it is we're doing with language. So taking a step outside and going, look, we think languages are things you can count. And we can lay them out in jars on a shelf, and we can say, here is Yoruba, and here is English, and this is the relationship between them. And Anna's point, and my point very much, is that there's so much more around enabling languages in the intercultural and the cultural and the artistic space that actually means that these boundaries, these understandings start to be blurred. And that's quite a frightening place to be when you have been trained in a particular understanding of scholarship. So I think we're watching some of these things being disinvented, as Sinfrey Makoni and Alistair Pennycook said in 2007. or as the wonderful scholar, and I advise you to listen to his podcasts, Bio Akomolafe, a real scholar of fugitivity, a real scholar of the decentering of ourselves, and a person who generously offers us a space to not quite understand what's happening around us, and to sit with it, to be with it in the subtlety of scholarship. He speaks a lot about how to find our way. We must become lost. Rather like the poet David Wagoner in that extraordinary poem he has about being lost, and saying, no two trees are the same to Robin. Stand still. The place where you are is called here. And sometimes in this cacophony of propaganda, in these terrible ways that words can be used, in the atrocious violences we see, that pause in silence may be one of the most important things we can do as part of beginning an understanding of necropolitics. So I'm interested very much in this talk in what is around about languages, a little like those kung fu movies where you see the gesture moving, and if it's slowed down on camera, it seems to have a lovely blur across it, and you can almost see and feel an energy and movement. That's what interests me around languages and cultures and arts. What is around languages? What's around what my lovely colleague Cristina Rossi Sole has said in her book, just out, it landed on my desk the day I left, called Intercultural Materialities. What's around the objects? What do the objects that we talk about allow us to do with language and make anew, with which we make multilingual worlds, and how we feel language, not so much as it explains things to us, but maybe as it tears, as it produces tears in us, and those words are obviously connected. How to live and how to language is, if you like, my question to myself as a scholar, but I think it's also a wider philosophical question to us as language people. How to live and how to language in such circumstances when the macro, the meso, those middle range, and also the micro, the small-scale structures that I experienced for 3 hours in a car with my driver, Jose, yesterday, seem inadequate at best, and you're not quite sure what to do with words, why words fail, and what it is that we in language and linguistics and intercultural studies might do to do our work and to do it effectively. So I'm going to start by looking at the enabling environments of language, and start with this wonderful book written, I think, back in the 50s by J.L. Austin. Many of us have to read it as a key text. Basically, it's the notes written up off his lectures. It's a bit like Saussure. I find it really quite extraordinary that in language disciplines, often what we're relying on are the undergraduate lecture notes of great scholars. So Saussurean linguistics famously was the undergraduate lecture notes of Saussure's lectures. And similarly, J.L. Austin, his lecture notes from his series of lectures on how to do things with words. A fantastic book. And yes, hugely debated in the 1980s, really key debates, particularly with Jacques Derrida and the deconstruction movement. But something's endured about Austin's key insight that words do things. And when we say them in a context where there is an enabling environment, when, for example, the late Queen Elizabeth II came to Glasgow with a bottle of champagne and smashed it against a ship and said, "I call this ship Queen Elizabeth II," that was the name of that ship. That's how to do things with words. Whereas, and I have tried this, maybe this shouldn't be on camera. If I go down to the docks in Glasgow, which are about a quarter of a mile from my house, with a bottle of champagne and smash it against a boat, I am likely to end up with a fine for vandalism. I don't have the right to say I name this ship Alison Phipps. God bless her and all who sail in her. So that, for those of you who've not encountered J.L. Austin's book, it's a really interesting and exciting little book. It's a little book. It's a bit like my little book on decolonizing multilingualism. written in an age of pamphleteering, really. But what I take from that is that the ceremony, the wraparound, the enabling environments around words are important. And the more I work with Indigenous peoples and people who are refugees or of refugee background, as well as being many other wonderful things in their lives, the more I see, of course, that all refugees are also Indigenous people in another place in the world, and that indigeneities know how to respect the ceremony that wraps our words, that do things in certain places. And you might come up with other examples, the naming of a child, a marriage ceremony. I pronounce you man and wife. It's kind of done, you know, there's tax implications after that's been said, by the right person in the right time. So one of the things I've tried to do with my scholarship, and this is very much about my own methodology, is to take it seriously and do it. So when Rilke, in his extraordinary Duino elegy, says, "Du musst dein Leben ändern," you have to change your life, sometimes in the face of circumstances which are so failing of words, then you have to do something. I found this as well with the work of J.L. Austin. I was like, well, if words do things, then I better do things with words. And I better be in a situation where we do stuff with words. So, of course, that takes me as an artist as well into poetry and into drama as my favourite artistic disciplines. They're not the only ones that I like to play with. And it is serious play. And one of the places where we've been doing things with words, under the grants that Loredana spoke about, and we've had a lot of money to do things with words. I mean, we should seriously be able to do a lot with words. In the last few years, I've probably been leading grants of worth around £30 million to do things with words. So, you know, we should be able to do a lot with words. And one of the places we've done things with words is at Litfest Harare. Now, Harare is obviously the capital city of Zimbabwe. It's a former colony. It has a bloody independence war. And we've been working with Chirikuya, who is my fantastic colleague. He's really the national poet of Zimbabwe these days, an extraordinary wordsmith. He's the best that Zimbabwe has, amongst many extraordinary poets. And he's got a huge heart for young people, particularly young people in the ghettos, as they call them, and also out in the smaller rural communities. So when we've started to work together, and very much the methods that we use are, you know, I'll phone him up or WhatsApp him and say, Chirikuya, what do you want to do? What will work? What do you see? What do the young people see? And he'll say, we want to set up a poetry slam. Great, let's do it. Let's find the money, let's set it up, let's do that. So we set up a poetry slam. The very first one we did, we thought, well, it kind of just happened. And we really were quite amazed by the fact that the old reparatory theatre in Mashingo, which used to be called Salisbury during the apartheid age, was only allowed to have white people in it, was packed with 600 young people in a poetry slam competition. We were there for 8 hours listening to this extraordinary poetry. And what was interesting about that was how much was about gender-based violence, how much was a quest for understanding about what a woman's body and a man's body were for and could do. We were really excited about this. This was spreading across the country. It was being picked up by our UN partners. And then the disabling environment occurred. And we received a letter, how not to do things with words. We received a letter via our Vice-Chancellor and on the website of the United Kingdom's Research Institutes, the main funding body of the United Kingdom, basically saying, dear Vice-Chancellor or Principal, it wasn't even personalised. You will have received a letter about ODA project funding from UKRI today. I regret to inform you that part of the wider measures to implement a reduction in government spend on international development, BEIS have instructed UKRI and Research England that there will be no QR GCRF available for 2001-2002. I didn't immediately understand it either. So if you're sitting there wondering what all those acronyms are and everything else, it's all that how not to do things with words, how to obfuscate, how to do violence, but pretend you're not doing it. It's the necroethics, the necropolitics coming through. Basically what it said was to everybody in receipt of a pot of money of 250 million in the UK, involved in projects like the little one that I described to you, but also medical trials. From today, no more money. Everyone's sacked. No notice. And in the UK, we usually have 3 months' notice. That was the letter. Hannah Arendt, back in the 1940s, said, evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. Think back to what I just read to you, dear Vice-Chancellor, Bayes, GCRF, Oda, Uplift. It finds nothing there. Empty words, emptied of meaning. And she said, that is the banality of evil. And I'm giving this back to you because reading it in context with all the other words around that famous slogan, I think is important. Evil comes from the failure to think. And it comes with my real encouragement to you, particularly those of you who are students here. Think, test everything and think. Thinking is what we have. And those of us who think with words, think with words. Loredana kindly paid tribute to what my husband would tell you is maybe not my most attractive of characteristics, stubbornness and obstinacy, but also a sense that in the face of gross injustice, and I strongly believed that to do this to my friends and colleagues of 15 years across the global south, in countries with the lowest GDP in the world, like Zimbabwe, like the occupied Palestinian territories, like Mexico and Morocco, like Ghana, like Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, Nepal, China, that this was an abomination, and therefore I was going to have to wreck my social life for a while. So this is a picture of me on the front page of the Guardian newspaper, posing for a photograph where they said to me, please will you look windswept and angry. So that's my best attempt. As you can see, I have a red version of the same cape that I am wearing here. Not all heroes wear capes, but I was attempting a heroic pose at the moment. They then put this, again, another example of how not to do things with words, this atrocious headline on it. This happens in Brazil, but not in Britain. Academics in despair as global research funds are pulled. And anti-violence projects in Kosovo, Latin America, Palestine, among the schemes cancelled or at risk as the UK funding agency halves the development budget. We had to tell our colleagues. This was not something that was done for us by those great producers of acronyms, those people who don't know how to do things with words. Instead, we had to phone them up on WhatsApp and say, I have some really bad news for you, Dabire. I have some really bad news for you, Chirikuya. And he's there with all these young people about to host a poetry slam where he can pay them a wage for doing poetry for the first time. They can be paid for working with words. And they say to us, this is violent information and we will go to jail because we have taken money from the British. And this is now tainted money because that's what happens in these times of turbulence and violence. Simone Weil, another thinker of the 1930s and 40s, coming out of that imprescriptible moment of the Holocaust, has written a wonderful essay called The Power of Words. And again, it's one I've gone back to, like Arendt's essay as well, and like J.L. Austin's, to really try and understand what is it that in my genealogy of thinkers about language, linguists were saying. What were they saying? What have they bequeathed us in the realm of thought? And she speaks of the myths and the monsters of the middle range. So what you read in that extract to the Vice-Chancellors, those are the myths and monsters of the middle range. The words empties of meaning. She says they're words that will pass away, that have been made up and have done extraordinary violence. And extraordinary violence has been done in their name. Names like nation or security or race or capitalism, or order, or authority, or property, or democracy. They're some of the ones she names to explain what she, as a woman, as a Jewish woman, was experiencing. And she says, when empty words are given capital letters, then on the slightest pretext, men, sick, will begin shedding blood for them, piling up ruin in their name, without effectively grasping anything to which they refer. It's almost like she and also Hannah Arendt are saying that in these times where we see evil undertaken, words come unstuck from meaning. All that stuff that we've done about signs and signifiers, it's kind of writ large in bloody letters, since what they refer to can never have any reality for the simple reading that they mean nothing. So again, these silences that we worry at and worry about, how do I find words? Words fail me, I don't know what to say. They're a diagnostic of a human condition around the perpetuation of these violences. I am going to cheer this up, I promise you. One of the things I did with my colleagues and during the time when we were defunded was find a way of defunding those of us in the global north and allowing our wages to be paid to members in the global south. I was enabled in that by my principal, who was a very good man and helped us out. So nobody lost their jobs in the global south. And all of us worked pro bono, 3.5 jobs in the global north. And one of the things we did was the resistance scholarly article. You may have come across the genre, but when bad things happen or bad reviews come to you, one of the things that sometimes it can help you do is write. So my colleague Maria Grazia Imperiale and myself wrote an article called Cuts, Destroy, Hurt, Kill, a critical metaphor-analysis of the response of UK academics to UK overseas aid budget funding. It's a thing to do with words, both as data and also as activism and as laying it down as those people I've spoken of laid it down for future generations. So we might know and spot and understand and see what's being done with words that we might want to head off at a pass later. And we also looked carefully at our own methodologies and the discourse, the language that enables our methodologies, particularly in the social sciences and the arts and humanities. And one of the things that we realized, and this was through our work with Bayo Akomolafe's thinking, was that much of our academic methodology around language and languages is extractivist. It's still based on understandings of colonial knowledge production, and it's built on the violence of what some in the Royal Geographical Society and Geological Society have called the Anthropocene, and what Donna Haraway has called the Plantationocene, honouring enslaved peoples who were the first to be really forced to do industrial levels of work with carbon that would produce the catastrophe that we are facing at the moment as we see carbon changing our worlds and our environment. But through those understandings of language and methodology, the task of the scholar was to capture it, to bring it in to the academy. Whereas Michael Cronin, the great translation scholar, has said, where we would burn it as rhetoric, the fossil fuel of our endeavours. And Bayo Akomolafe says this is toxic to our survival and to the survival of thought, and that the conceptual colonialisms which describe and perform it are no longer good, if they ever were. They're coming unstuck from what we used to do. They've done good work in the past, maybe, maybe not. We can debate that. We should debate that. But right now, there's some thinking to be done around how we talk as scholars about what it is we do and what the impact might be about how we talk about what it is we do. Those disabling environments that I've written about for UNRISD, the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development, this extractivist attitude to language where we talk about mining the data, codifying, cleansing data, capturing data. My staff in my team, my students in my team, are people who have been ethnically cleansed from their land. They are people who have been codified as subhuman by the placement of a pencil in their hair. If the pencil slips out, they are human, and if the pencil stays in their hair, they are classified as cattle. They have seen their land sold to external agencies for capital. So to use this word in our teaching and our classes is to perpetuate a violence. And to name it is to say we need to find other words together that we might agree are words that will work. So, how not to do things with words is really a key element of how I've been thinking over the years. Perhaps we should begin to reform, revise our scientific methods of education and popularization and abolish some of this vocabulary that maybe doesn't serve us well any longer. I told you I was going to cheer you up. Here's some more words. This was a letter sent to the Vice-Chancellor and President and to myself. It was a Friday afternoon email. You all know about Friday afternoon emails, don't you? The ones that are sent with good news or bad news for you to stew on over the weekend. This is what they said to us. And this was after we'd fought tooth and nail and reapplied for all of the money that we'd lost. We'd forced by-elections, we'd forced a vote of no confidence in the British Prime Minister and the British government, which we had won, I will have you know, and we'd also managed to get to a point where there was potentially going to be a restoration of funds. It had taken us 9 months and a lot of very smart activists getting together as scholars. But we got this email and it said UKRI applied the good, G-O-O-D, that's a lot of capital letters, cost effectiveness multiplier based on the mode score, applying the Bayes value for money methodology. The average rubric score was then multiplied by the worthwhileness multiplier. After applying the cost-effectiveness multiplier, the value for money score translates to a final score, which equals 4. So we knew that having had to reapply for £25 million, according to radically different criteria to the ones that we'd got it for the first time around after 10 levels of peer review, we'd then been evaluated again, and this was the news on a Friday afternoon. Hi, Dabire. Do you understand this? Nope, I don't understand this either. So I phoned UKRI. I'd got them on speed dial at this point. They basically had so many articles written about them in Research Fortnightly News. This is the newspaper that the Vice-Chancellors in the UK read. And they really wanted me not to do any more interviews with Research Fortnightly News. It was really rather embarrassing. So they asked me if I might phone them up if I had a concern. So I said, what does that mean? I said, what is 4 out of? You know, is 4 out of 100? Is 4 out of 10? Is 4 out of 20? Is 4 out of 5? What is 4 out of? You know, it's probably out of one of those numbers because, you know, in the numerical regimes that I've described, we do things in 10s or 5s. And they said, we don't yet know what it is out of. But we will know later. Meanwhile, there's a wonderful project being undertaken with the UNESCO section on intercultural dialogue. And if you don't know their work, I really commend it to you. There's loads of free resources and work going on from the small team in Paris that work there. And as UNESCO chair, I work closely with that team around intercultural dialogue and understanding. And they decided that if you can't beat them, join them. We need to work with the economists. And we need to understand the value of intercultural dialogue and languages. And we need to do this using the numbers that I've just been debunking. And they phoned me up and said, will you work with us on this? So I swallowed hard and swallowed my principles and acknowledged that there's no pure place to be and looked at what they had done with the economics for enabling intercultural dialogue for peace. And what they'd done was an econometric survey to see across all of the countries that are member states of UNESCO, which is about 192, what it was in each member state that created an environment where dialogue was possible interculturally and multilingually. Now, if their project had been graded by UKRI, it probably would have fallen at first peer review. It was a monstrous project all those countries, all that work. But they came up with some really interesting findings. And they came up with a finding that really wasn't all that surprising, which was that in countries with strong and stable economic structures and with financial resources, then the conditions for enabling intercultural dialogue that have been outlined by UNESCO are largely met. If you're a rich country, you can do it, more or less. And if you've got a democracy, you can probably do it, more or less. If you haven't, it's a lot harder. But what fascinated me, this is me in a UNESCO World Heritage Site last weekend in a cave in Assynt in the north of Scotland, playing the Mbira instrument, which is part of the living heritage, the intangible cultural heritage record and it's a posed photograph. Somebody wanted me to do this, so I thought I'd better show it to you first. But what fascinated me about their research were the two outliers, the things that didn't fit the statistics. And the outliers were around leadership and around freedom of expression. And so I looked back at all the research we've done across all the countries that don't fit that profile, that aren't high GDP countries, that don't have money or democracy or strong systems, where, you know, a university library has 3 dusty books in it, where there's very little chance of getting online. And in those contexts, I identified with my team the things that meant that it was possible to actually buck the trend and still do amazing work. And we found that leaders who were risk takers, who worked collaboratively, who worked multilingually, who worked in an interdisciplinary way, in fact, who had all of the characteristics of the MIC Centre here at Stony Brook, were able to foster the context for intercultural dialogue, despite even some of the most repressive regimes we know on the planet. And we also found that freedom of expression, depending on how it was interpreted artistically and linguistically, was also able to produce extraordinary enabling environments. So with my colleagues working on gender-based violence in these countries on the list, and with the organisations I mentioned, we wrote a report which you can read. It's freely available and downloadable and in the resources I passed on to you, about those characteristics and how we might foster those characteristics, particularly around freedom of expression. Now, you can read it for yourself. I don't want to go over it in too much detail, but these are some of the characteristics that were identified as critical to bucking the trend, to not being paralysed, not being stuck in the silence, not saying there's nothing I can do or nothing I can say. And first of all, there were the observers, the people who had an acuity, an acute sense of vision, who were able to describe things well, linguistically, academically, artistically, and the journalists, and the human rights observers. Those people were critical in different roles, be it through the United Nations or particularly in universities and artistic institutions. The people who opened things out rather than closing things down, when nothing was off the table and even deeply uncomfortable views could be met and engaged with compassion. Where people did what Paulo Freire speaks about, pronunciar o mundo, they could name or pronounce the world, make it in being with language and in their mother languages. And that was critical, and I know you're going to hear from Antonella later, and you've got a real treat in store, I can tell you, when she speaks to you. But people who could witness with words and their words, own them, speak from them, use them, not just codify them in an English that's extracted or expected, or a colonial language that's expected or extracted, but find a freedom in those words, even words like mother tongue or mother language, which we think of as biological, but in many parts of the world is understood as the language that the community speaks with us. And therefore it's many languages. You know, the neighbours don't speak in the same accent or dialect as we do. It's a repertoire, it's a feast. Sense checking, rehearsal, practice was vital. Those artistic capacities that mean that you might play the violin really badly the first time you pick it up, but if you practice every day, you're gonna get good at it and it'll sound amazing. Anything that works with a third term, not necessarily face-to-face, you and I, but let's talk about the colour of the carpet. That we have in common. That's the ground we stand on. And in some of the work that I've done, particularly in the Gaza Strip and with Israel over the years around peacemaking, I've relied on the work of Carolyn Gutzig, who says, when people are reduced to only being enemy and enemy, there is nothing to speak of. But when we can expand our identities out culturally, and we can see someone as enemy and father, or enemy and sister, that I am too, we have a place to start. In language, in description. Brave spaces, it kind of goes without saying, but also ones working not to destroy, divide, and to only name the violence, but which are restorative, which are joyful, which celebrate, which show that despite all the odds, here's something beautiful that still persists, that we still made together. And that's then about constantly committing to the failed project of intercultural education anew, the failed project of multilingualism anew in the work we do, of being joy. I think to do that, I think that's a big ask of any individual. I think we have to do it together. And I see colleagues around the world, and the distinguished scholars you're going to hear from today are a case in point. I see people doing this and practicing an important element in their methodological work of what Bayo Akomolafe has called fugitivity, which moves us into the undeterminiverse. This is a very large word that he's using, but he's really saying brave scholars who are thinking about how we flee what does not serve, how we become fugitives from structures or ideas or words or methods that may have been okay but now really need laying down, and how we move into a space which is as yet undetermined. In that there is a liberatory potential because it is not yet determined. And if we go into that at not saying, this is a space that only white men can determine, or only people with guns can determine, or that can only be determined by a colonial power. But if we go into that space and say, this is a space that is a space of potentialities, then new namings might come out of those generative liberatory pedagogies that Paulo Freire speaks about. And that requires us, and this is difficult for somebody like me, of my skin colour, my heritage, my background, that we unlearn the mastery that's about capturing, cleansing, mining, that we say, we don't know, we have no words. We may have to sing for a while, or weave or paint. So in my work, what I've done, and I'm coming to the last part of my talk here, is work with restorative methods. And that's building on the work of my colleague, Hiab Johannes, who is a survivor of torture and a survivor of trafficking. There is nothing of the worst of what human beings can do to another that he has not experienced. And he is the most joyful person I know. And he's also one of the smartest. I really think he should be standing here rather than me. And he's helped us frame our work as being about holding the bowl of tears, not denying, but creating a vessel that might be patched up like the calabash on the screen, but which is strong enough to hold what we have to encounter now, and expanding a space for joy. And that needs a fugitivity, it needs leadership, it needs freedom of expression. So these are some of the places where we've worked like this with communities who know how to make joy, who are funny, who are witty, who are joyful, who are clever, who are smart, who don't just buckle when UKRI sends a Friday afternoon email, and who offer a counter story, one that can allow us to change, as Walter Brueggemann has said. People don't change or change much through doctrine or argument or sheer cognitive appeal. They may have done in the past, but they don't any longer. Today it's half-forgotten models, one therapy session at a time, one word at a time, one poem at a time. So in that spirit, we've worked with one poem at a time, one quilt at a time. These are quilts made to the women who were killed in femicide in Mexico by the families to commemorate them. The authorities refused to put them in the register of the dead. So the women made a beautiful register of the dead, and they rolled it up and they put it in a suitcase and they brought it to Ghana and they hung it from a tower in front of the United Nations gathered there. as a document, as a witness, as a testimony, not in words, but in threads, but naming with a hummingbird or a beautiful passion flower that could remember that collective work of grief, the wrapping, the enabling of a remembering. Or in Zimbabwe, where the theatre has remembered the young women who were impregnated in their families during the COVID regime and who found a way to speak out about those experiences. Or in Morocco, where there's a religious divide that often means women are not allowed to sell the wares that they've made in the market. So instead, they made wonderful films that you can see for yourselves. Or in the Gaza Strip, where I've worked for 15 years, with women who put on a theatre festival back in 2023 in March, under the direction of my late colleague, Dr. Rafat Al-Ariya, who wrote the most translated poem in the world, which went round the world and was translated many times after he was assassinated, and led a wonderful theatre festival where women online could show the world the dramas of their lives, particularly domestic violence that they had experienced under the conditions of siege, but also what it is like to live in a permanent war environment. And in Ghana, in the rural townships where there's often forced marriage, we worked with dance to help communities come into a dialogue about forced marriage and think about how they might change that, but also how to write popular songs. And one of the songs that one of the popular songwriters wrote in the languages of the north of Ghana has since become quite a hit and really helped people talk about what forced marriage might be. So for me in this work, another method is to make English take a step back. Not to say we don't need English, we do, of course we do. Of course we have to have common conversations like these, but to allow other languages in first, to allow people the solidity of speaking of their pain or their joy in the language that is the one that is dearest to them, that they choose rather than the one we choose. And when we do that, we find that there is a space that is sometimes opaque, but that's okay, that gives us time for translation, and that slows things down, and that's good. That is incoherent, but that means we've got to try and make new meaning that's often untranslatable. Okay then, we better do better. That's discomforting, that's conflictual, but also that's baroque, that's exuberant, that has many elements to it. So there's much for us to work with and look at and think with in our work. We are in a place, if you like, of abundance. When working in these spaces, we found first and foremost that those first things we teach people to do in second language, third language, fourth language classes, those words of courtesy, of meeting and greeting and eating, are critical. Courtesy is fugitivity. Language needs courtesy, says Podrigo Tuma, to guide it. Precision won't do for healing work. We've also found we need beauty. Elaine Scarry has said that people seem to wish there to be beauty even when their own self-interest is not served by it. Or perhaps more accurately, people seem to intuit that their own self-interest is served by distant peoples having the benefit of beauty. This is an icon from Eritrean refugees painted on the church that they built out of sticks and plastic in the refugee camps in Calais, where they could go every day and sit in silence in their own faith traditions. That silence again, a silence that is reverencing, a silence that is mourning, a silence that wraps a space where we know we have no words. And we might have to ask better questions. Sometimes what we need to say is, it's not a good question. Like the question we were asked in the United Kingdom in the Brexit referendum, do you want to be in or out? This was not a good question. And it wasn't solved with a simple answer, yes or no. Unask the precision-loaded questions. Do you condemn, yes or no? These are not questions we use in peace building. These are not questions of nuance and subtlety. These are not questions that honor the ancestors, like Hannah Arendt or Simone Weil or J.L. Austin. Tell me your story might be a better way to start. Tell me the story you want to tell me, not the one I think I want to hear. How then shall we live? Why does it have to be this way? what choices of ours could bring change, however small, and be part of that picture. Words are the way to survive a life, says Podrigo Tuma, and to turn an experience you would rather not have had, and you will have many, into something where you can say you are sacramentalizing it, wrapping something around it. Both through that periods of cuts, but also every day since the International Court of Justice made its ruling in response to the South African application around the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. I have written a short poem or cry that has named the experiences in the tradition of Victor Klemperer, that great diarist of the Holocaust, to try and wrap something around the space where words fail. This is about engaging in a rigorous, searching, restorative language methodology. Of course, it is decolonizing, decentering, decreating, deconstructing. It insists on destituting violence in all its forms to make peace, to pull the power that violence has away from itself, to take the fear away, might be a different way of saying it, and our extractivisms, to allow for fugitivity and rest and narration, and to be part of an intentional artistry that will allow us to improvise and devise in the undeterminables, to not know what we're doing. Linguistic fugitivity for us, I think, might be, and I use those words advisedly, I'm not yet sure. It is undetermined. But what I'm finding in my work is that when I do what Simone Weil said we should do and say, maybe this will work to the extent that, or in the case where, maybe when we use these subtle qualifiers, these very ordinary words, maybe we'll be in a space of doing things with words that can enable an environment. This is about becoming unlost, but in very subtle ways, as Anne Carson has said, thinking about the fugitive as a way of wayfaring, as Tim Ingold has said, as a way of knowing, being in a space where you're not sure where you go next, but that is knowledge. And to not know is to know. To not know is also to know. Opacity, Glisson said, can be a sheltering place. Obfuscation, multiplying edges, modes of expression become life-saving and life-enriching as a place of dignity. And that is where multilingualism is one of the pamphlets we need for this. The more words for peace, the better. The more words for again, as Agnes showed me as we came into this building, the better. Even when never again becomes again and again and again. And a languaged fugitivity in relationship to objects and to people, to one another. This needs courtesy and it needs ceremony, and that's what I believe our work is to do with words. Not throwing a bottle of champagne at a ship, though that might be fun, but maybe thinking in quite muted and careful, ceremonial ways about what we do, because precision won't do for this kind of healing, and because there is no single word big enough for the hell that is being endured. There are concrete resistances that must be undertaken by some, and in the place where one is. And the rest of it is about our relationships with one another in every space we find ourselves in. And that is why I believe Glisson says, I can no longer live in a monolingual way. So my question as a longer question becomes, how can we find collective, languaged, fugitive spaces for liberation from that which needs to be restored? And I want to finish with the words of one of my favourite poets and thinkers, Corinne Polwart. And she takes us outside of ourselves and into the more than human world. And she says, in October, the geese snake in across the Firth of Forth, from their summer nests in Iceland and the coast cliffs of Greenland, clattering and honking in an ever-shifting skein. My garden is a flight path, she says. I watch, I listen. The outstretched wingtips of each migrating goose create an upwash, a pocket of wind resistance for the geese tucked in behind and below. These nooks of ease, these aerodynamic sanctuaries, they cut the drag by up to 65%. It's a wonder and a gale-bitten struggle to sustain cooperation, but every goose takes a turn, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Jokingly, she says they're like sky-born socialists. No lone bird bears the brunt. It's a gorgeous symbiotic dance. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. But I fear for the weather to come, she says, and we're not going to make it alone. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Thank you.
Stay there, don't go away. You know what I meant. You know, it's thank you. So what a way to open these 2 days of celebration. Agnes asked me, and I always do what Agnes asks. Agnes asked me to have a few remarks, but I'll keep them very short because I'm sure there will be comments, there will be questions from our audience. They'll want to know more. There are just some things that I wrote down, and it started with that image you were giving us of language which is more than words, language which is also movement, which is also other things. And it made me think of that beautiful, beautiful early essay by Talal Azad, in which he said, well, why, as ethnographers, extracting, mining those things, what if someone wanted to translate themselves into dance instead? And that also made me think at the same time of what you said about, refugees, indigenous people. They're the same thing. And they're also, at any time, so many other things. We are also always so many other things, not being redacted. What you said about what happened, that debacle with the Global Challenges Research Fund, I remember that day, and I no longer had funding from it. I had it, but I was in the, I was in the frame, and I was in the peer college. And I remember the shock of that day, thinking, they can do this, they cannot do this. But the way in which that, which is pure, you saw it, it's pure Monty Python speech. But the way that gets turned into something else, gets turned into activism and scholarship and intellectual work, activism as intellectual work, and vice versa. And how important that risk-taking, that engaging with obstinacy against obstinacy, whatever your husband may say, I think that is, again, so important. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on are some of those words, resistance, fugitivity, compassion, finding other words, how important that is for us and for that distinction between what to do, what not to do with words. And then the very last thing, again, that I want to pick up on what you were talking about, I've got all my notes scattered around here, is the beautiful thing you said at the beginning about remembering and celebrating what our students say and what they do and how advanced, how far that can take us. And I was thinking, I've been talking about that Austin book, I've been talking about the question also of affectivity. We've been working on language maps with my students and how that does tell us about the love, the beauty, the shame, the rage, the joy, the desire. And I said to her, I warned her, I will quote her forever. One of my students made up this wonderful Italian word. she said she'd put on her map German and Chinese, which she didn't speak, but her friends had esposata her to it. And it's esposata is exposed, but it's also married, wedded, embraced.
Beautiful.
And I said, I want that word.
That's
We
the word.
invent that
That's the
word,
word.
exactly. That's how those language words can do things with us. So, yeah, one quilt at a time, one word at a time, one dance, one song, or one poem at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Loredana.
I'm sure you have a few questions. I know we have a break coming up, but I'm sure you will have comments or questions for Alison. Raise your hand, and I'll Agnes.
I'm just shout. Well, English is not my first language. I'm sure it's obvious, but I thought I knew the word fugitivity. But you have challenged me to relearn that word, what fugitivity means. That's me speaking as a learner, a lifelong learner of the English language. But also, I'm thinking that we are very often buried in the challenges and problems associated with multilingualism, and we forget the power and the poetry that is so evident in your talk, right? So it is whether it is a misery, suffering, or what is the joy, the celebration that's associated with language and other semiotic, the use of other semiotic tools. It's so powerful and it's so absolutely beautiful, poetic, as you put it. So I want to thank you for that. Question is, this comes down to me doing the research center, working with colleagues. I do work, and I would also like to enable and encourage my colleagues to do work, is that in the vast span of universe that you have touched upon, we are worried about Stony Brook campus, right? We're worried about our little environment, but you have taken us to places and peoples that I normally do not have time to think about, unless I'm listening to NPR News on my way, on my drive here. But other than that, I don't think about those kinds of problems very often. So how do we translate all of this really broad understandings of the world's concerns, real issues of humans and environments and so forth, and how do we translate that into research projects?
Wonderful research projects. Yeah.
Sorry for this mundane.
No, but it is the question. It is the question, and it's the question for all of us as scholars. How can we do it well, and do it in a way that will work, but also do it in a way that's effective on the ways in which everything is counted, and that brings the research funding to the work we're trying to do. And I don't know I have easy and good answers. I mean, my answer when I'm normally asked that question is we need to fill out an awful lot of forms, which comes back to, and mostly when I'm asked that question, people want an answer that is kind of like a grand philosophical idea, or a book that you can read, or a reference you can put on your funding application, or a way of structuring it. And actually, I've just come to realize in most of the places that it's just an awful lot of form filling. And you need to get good at form filling, and that form filling is a bit like trying to be a really good violinist. I'm now really well practiced at form filling. And I remember we run an annual spring school. We do it online and we do it in person, and it's free, and you're all welcome to come to either. We do it in May in the Global North Spring, and we've just had it last week in the Global South Spring. And it's just a beautiful thing. But I remember walking into the room and seeing the people there and thinking, and adding, I have trouble sleeping from time to time, so I count the number of words I put on forms that day, and that usually sends me off to sleep. And I remember thinking, how many words have I put on forms to enable this to happen? As a person who has to lead this, and it was 4 million. 4 million words had to go onto forms in order to enable that to happen. The thing I'm most grateful to my PhD supervisor, my doctoral advisor, for making me learn to do in the first 6 weeks of my PhD was to touch type, because then I can put more words on forms. But a lot of it is about being really canny with what the funding applications are asking for. Canny, does that word clever, smart. It's a Scottish word. And thinking about what is the rubric, what can be done, what is in our desire to do, and how might we then focus on that and wrap it in a form, and that the form is one of the ways of that word, that strange word that Padraig Ó Tuama uses of sacramentalizing it, because those are our gods, those are our systems, those are the ones we communicate with in those ways. So getting good at filling out forms. And my colleagues in the Global South, they don't need me to do any of the fun stuff. They're far better at it than me, or the scholarship for that matter, or the interpretation of the scholarship. What they need is for me to advocate for on-time payments with our finance department. So that's what I've had to get good at. And if I get good at that, I've discovered, I will be funded again. But if I'm not good at it, then we won't be funded again. So there's something about the absolute prosaic nuts and bolts that is really important, weirdly.
But Alison, fairly, there's also a risk-taking,
Yeah.
a willingness to risk-take
Yeah.
to go with that.
Yeah. So
I think that has to be said.
So maybe one other thing. So in the interview for the large grant that we were sisters on, I was interviewed and I was asked, we'd said we wanted to make something and we wanted to make an artistic production. And the interviewers said to us, what are you going to make? And I took a really deep breath. Now, I could have given an answer and I think we would still have been funded, but the answer wouldn't have been honest. And I said, if I can give you an answer to that question, you should not fund this work, because we are going to work this out between us in a participatory way. And that was the risk. And so I think there's something about spotting the due risk, not being stupidly risky, but sort of finding where is it that you can land, where you'll land on 2 feet. You'll jump off stage, but you'll land on 2 feet. I did my yoga this morning. Nearly 57, but I can still jump.
Well, we'll talk more about all this tomorrow as well.
Absolutely.
I think we need to go for a break, but is there another question you can grab Alison.
I'm around.
Can we thank her again, please, for the